So many trees.
It's beautiful.
Okay, so what do you think?
They knew the power of that place. Belong to something up in those woods.
What if the place you buried someone could bring them back, but not as the person you remember? In this Pet Cemetery 2019 review, we uncover the darkest facts, shocking moments, and terrifying secrets behind the movie. Welcome to Kali Facts. Let's dig into the story and discover why some things are better left dead. Pet Sematary is a 2019 American supernatural horror movie directed by Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmeyer, with a screenplay written by Jeff Buhler. The movie is based on Stephen King's 1983 novel Pet Sematary. It is the second movie adaptation of the novel, coming after the 1989 film, and it is also the third movie in the Pet Sematary film series. The movie stars Jason Clarke, Amy Seimetz, and John Lithgow. The story follows the Creed family, who move into a new home and soon discover a strange old graveyard hidden in the woods behind their property. But this isn't just some normal cemetery. This mysterious place has the terrifying power to bring dead things back to life. The idea of making a new Pet Cemetery movie first came up in March 2010. At that time, Matt Greenberg was hired to work on the screenplay. Producers Lorenzo Di Bonaventura and Steven Schneider were also attached to the project, while Juan Carlos Fresnadillo was in talks to direct the movie. However, the project took years to finally move forward. By December 2017, Paramount Pictures officially gave the green light to a new movie based on Stephen King's novel. Filmmakers Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmeyer were chosen to direct the film. The movie then started moving into production, with the main filming beginning in June 2018. Production took place in Montreal and Hudson, Quebec in Canada. The filming process continued through the summer and was finally completed in August 2018. Pet Sematary had its first premiere at the South by Southwest Festival on March 16, 2019. After that, the movie was released in theaters across the United States on April 5, 2019 by Paramount Pictures. The movie was made with a production budget of around $20 million and ended up making more than $113 million worldwide. Even though the movie performed well at the box office, Critics had mixed opinions about it. Some people liked the creepy atmosphere, horror scenes, and performances, while others felt that the movie did not fully live up to the original Stephen King story. At its core, Pet Sematary is about grief, family, and the dangerous things people might do when they just can't accept losing someone they love. The Creed family thinks they've found a peaceful place to start a new life. But after discovering the mysterious burial ground in the woods, their lives quickly turn into a nightmare. What starts as a strange discovery soon becomes a terrifying battle with death itself. Louis Creed, his wife Rachel, and their two young kids, Ellie and Gage, move into a quiet house deep in the woods outside Ludlow, Maine. At first, they think they've found the perfect place to start a fresh life away from the busy city. But things quickly get creepy. One day, Ellie follows a group of children who are walking through the woods in a strange funeral procession. She ends up discovering an old pet cemetery with the word cemetery misspelled on the sign. While she's there, she meets their elderly neighbor, Judd Randall. Judd quickly becomes close with the Creed family and starts looking out for them. Louis works at a university hospital where he deals with life and death situations every day. One day, a college student named Victor Pascoe is brought into the hospital after being hit by a car. Louis does everything he can, but he can't save him. Victor dies, and soon afterward, Louis starts having disturbing nightmares about him. In the dreams, Victor warns Louis to stay away from the woods and tells him that the barrier must not be broken. Louis has no idea what Victor means, but the warning seriously freaks him out. At the same time, Rachel is dealing with painful memories from her childhood. She was deeply traumatized by the death of her older sister Zelda, who died as a teenager from spinal meningitis. Rachel remembers Zelda's illness and death in a terrifying way, and those memories have stayed with her for years. Because of this, Rachel has always been extremely afraid of death and the idea of losing someone she loves. Things get even worse when the family's beloved cat, Church, gets hit by a truck and dies. Louis and Judd find the cat and they both know Ellie is going to be completely crushed when she finds out. Judd decides to help Louis with a terrible secret. He takes Louis deep into the woods past the normal pet cemetery and shows him another burial ground. Judd tells Louis to bury Church there. Louis doesn't fully understand what he's getting into, but he follows Judd's instructions and buries the cat. The next day, Louis is shocked when Church suddenly comes back home alive. But this isn't the same sweet cat anymore. Church looks dirty, acts aggressive, and seems completely different. He scratches Ellie and even brings a dead bird into the house. Louis knows something is seriously wrong, so he confronts Judd. Judd finally tells him the truth. The strange burial ground has the power to bring dead things back to life, but there's a price. Judd explains that the place is connected to an ancient supernatural creature known as the Wendigo. The native people who once lived in the area, feared the woods and eventually abandoned the land because of what was living there. After Louis sees Church sitting strangely on top of Gage while the baby is sleeping in his crib, he realizes the cat is dangerous. Louis takes Church away and leaves him beside the road. When Ellie asks about her cat, Louis lies and tells her that Church ran away. Meanwhile, Louis and Rachel continue having disturbing nightmares about Victor, Pascal, and Zelda, and the strange supernatural events around them keep getting worse. Later, the Creed family throws a birthday party for Ellie. Everything seems normal for a while as Ellie plays hide and seek with her friends. But during the game, Ellie suddenly spots Church standing out in the road. She runs after him without thinking. Gage follows her, and before Louis can react, Gage nearly gets hit by a speeding truck. Louis rushes in and saves his son just in time. The truck driver swerves to avoid hitting Gage, but the sudden move causes a huge tank attached to the truck to break loose. The heavy tank crashes into the road and hits Ellie, who is still standing there. Ellie is killed instantly. The Creed family is completely destroyed by the tragedy. Louis can't believe his daughter is gone, and Rachel is devastated. Rachel takes Gage and leaves to stay with her parents for a few days. Louis, still unable to accept what happened, goes to Judd for help. Judd immediately realizes what Louis is thinking. He knows Louis is considering using the supernatural burial ground to bring Ellie back. Judd warns him not to do it. He tells Louis that bringing Ellie back would be a huge mistake and that the thing that returns may not truly be Ellie anymore. But Louis is too broken to listen. After Judd passes out from drinking, Louis takes his chance. He goes to the cemetery, digs up Ellie's body, and carries her deep into the woods. He buries her in the same mysterious burial ground where Church was buried. Later that night, Ellie comes back. But just like Church, she isn't the same. She looks pale and strange, and there's something cold and mean about her. Her personality has completely changed, and it's clear that whatever came back isn't the sweet little girl Louis remembers. Meanwhile, Rachel starts getting seriously freaked out when Gage begins having nightmares. Even worse, the little boy starts talking about Victor Pascal by name, even though he shouldn't know who Pascal is. Rachel becomes convinced that something terrible is happening at home. She tries to call Louis, but she can't get through. While stuck in traffic, she calls Judd and asks him to check on the family. Judd goes over to the Creed house, but Louis turns him away. Before leaving, though, Judd looks up at the house and sees Ellie staring at him through her bedroom window. Judd immediately gets scared and runs back to his own house. He grabs his pistol because he believes Ellie has become dangerous and needs to be stopped. But before he can do anything, Church suddenly attacks and distracts him. That gives Ellie the opening she needs. She grabs a scalpel that she stole from Louis and slices Judd's ankle. Judd is badly hurt and unable to defend himself. Ellie then starts messing with his mind. She takes the appearance of Judd's dead wife, Norma, using the memory of the woman Judd loved most to completely terrify him. Ellie then attacks Judd and stabs him to death. Not long after, Rachel and Gage finally arrive back at the Creed house. Louis is shocked to see them because he didn't expect them to come home so soon. Ellie walks up to Rachel and introduces herself. Rachel immediately knows something is wrong. She sees her daughter standing there, but the girl doesn't feel like the Ellie she remembers. Terrified, Rachel grabs Gage and runs upstairs. Louise tries to convince Rachel that Ellie is still their daughter and that everything is going to be okay. But when he looks around, he realizes Ellie has disappeared. Louis heads over to Judd's house to find her. Back at the Creed home, Rachel is suddenly attacked by Ellie, who is carrying a knife. Ellie stabs Rachel, but Rachel manages to escape into the bathroom with Gage. She locks the door and tries to keep Ellie away from them. Louis finds Judd's dead body and realizes just how dangerous Ellie has become. He rushes back home and sees Rachel trying to lower Gage out of the bathroom window to get him to safety. Louis catches Gage before the boy can fall. But while he's distracted, Ellie attacks Rachel again. Rachel is stabbed and badly wounded. Louis puts Gage inside the car and locks the doors, hoping to keep him safe. He then goes back into the house and finds Rachel barely alive. Rachel desperately begs Louis not to bury her in the mysterious pet cemetery if she dies, but Louis has already gone too far. Ellie attacks Louis and knocks him unconscious. She then drags Rachel's body deep into the woods and buries her in the supernatural burial ground. Louis eventually wakes up and follows Ellie into the woods. He finds her and the two of them fight. Louis knows he has to stop her, even though she looks like his daughter. Just when Louis is about to kill Ellie, Rachel suddenly appears. She has been brought back from the dead, just like Ellie and Church. Rachel attacks Louis and stabs him. Louis dies, and Rachel and Ellie bury him in the same cursed ground. The three of them then return to Judd's house and set it on fire, completely destroying it. Afterward, they walk toward the car where Gage is still sitting inside. Louis, now resurrected and no longer truly himself, approaches the car. He silently gestures toward Gage. Gage reaches for the door and unlocks it. The door opens. And just as the terrifying family moves toward him, the screen suddenly cuts to black, casting Jason Clarke as Louis Creed. The casting of Jason Clarke in the central role of Dr. Louis Creed marked one of the earliest and most pivotal announcements for the 2019 adaptation of Stephen King's novel. On April 16, 2018, reports confirmed that Clark had entered negotiations and subsequently signed on to portray the Boston physician who relocates his family to rural Maine only to confront the supernatural forces tied to the ancient burial ground behind their new home. Clark, an Australian actor with a substantial body of work in both independent and major studio films, brought a grounded intensity suited to a character defined by rationalism, gradually eroded by grief and desperation. Clark's prior credits included standout performances in Zero Dark 30, where he played a CIA operative navigating moral ambiguity, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, in which he embodied a conflicted human leader, and Everest, where he portrayed real life mountaineer Rob Hall under extreme physical and emotional pressure. These roles demonstrated his capacity for portraying men under duress, a quality essential for Louis Creed, whose arc moves from professional detachment as a university doctor to a man willing to violate the natural order. Directors Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmeyer sought an actor who could convey both the everyday warmth of a devoted father and the quiet unraveling that follows tragedy. Clark's ability to underplay emotion while allowing it to surface in subtle physical shifts aligned with the film's emphasis on psychological horror over pure spectacle. In interviews surrounding the production, Clark discussed approaching the material as a drama first and a horror film second. He noted that the story's power lies in its intimacy and the universal question of what a parent might do to reverse irreversible loss. Clark, prepared by reading King's novel multiple times, absorbing the internal monologues that reveal Louis's rationalizations. On set, he worked closely with the directors to calibrate the character's progression, ensuring that each decision felt inevitable rather than sudden. Chemistry reads with potential co stars, particularly the child actors, proved decisive. Clark participated in sessions that tested young performers' ability to match his intensity without being overpowered, a process that ultimately helped secure Jete Lawrence for the role of Ellie. Clark's physical presence, tall, solid, with a face capable of both approachable warmth and hardened resolve, helped establish Louis as an everyman figure audiences could project onto. Makeup and wardrobe choices reinforced this. Practical clothing suitable for a rural doctor later contrasted with the dirt and exhaustion of his nocturnal journeys to the burial ground. The performance required scenes of profound quiet alongside moments of frantic action, and Clark delivered both with consistency. Supporting the central family dynamic demanded sustained emotional availability across long shooting days, particularly in sequences involving the twins portraying Gage and the evolving relationship with Lithgow's Judd Crandall. Amy Seimetz as Rachel Creed in June 2018. Amy Seimetz was announced as Rachel Creed, Louis's wife and the mother of Ellie and Gage. Seimetz, known for her work as an actress, writer, and director in independent cinema, brought a different energy to the role than previous interpretations. Her filmography included Upstream Color, The Killing, Stranger Things, and The Girlfriend Experience, roles that often explored psychological complexity, trauma, and fractured relationships. The casting of Seimetz signaled the filmmaker's interest in expanding Rachel beyond the more passive figure, sometimes seen in earlier adaptations. Rachel's backstory centers on the childhood death of her sister Zelda from spinal meningitis, a trauma that leaves her with lasting fear of death and illness. Seimetz's performance had to convey both everyday maternal protectiveness and the deeper recurring nightmares that surface throughout the narrative. Directors Kelsch and Widmeyer valued her ability to access emotional extremes while maintaining naturalism. Seimetz herself spoke of drawing on personal experiences of emotional turbulence to inform the darker passages of the character. The 2019 script gave Rachel greater agency and presence in the escalating events, a change that allowed Seimetz to play a more active participant rather than a figure largely kept off screen during key developments. Chemistry between Seimetz and Clark was essential to selling the Creed marriage as a believable partnership under strain. Their shared scenes of domestic routine, arguments over family decisions, and mutual support in crisis required an unforced rapport. Seimetz's background in improvisation and character driven independent work contributed to moments of lived in dialogue, some of which emerged during filming and ADR. Costume and hair design positioned Rachel as a contemporary mother adjusting to rural life, practical yet carrying traces of urban sensibility, while later sequences demanded visible signs of exhaustion and fear. Seimetz's involvement extended to supporting the child performers, working with Jete Lawrence and the Lava twins required patience and the capacity to create a secure on-set environment amid intense material. The role also involved sequences of physical and emotional vulnerability, including the manifestation of Rachel's childhood memories of Zelda. Seimetz's commitment to these scenes helped ground the supernatural elements in recognizable human pain. John Lithgow as Judd Crandall. John Lithgow joined the cast on May 4, 2018 as Judd Crandall, the elderly neighbor who befriends the Creed family and ultimately reveals the secrets of the burial ground. Lithgow, a veteran of stage, television, and film with a career spanning decades, brought both gravitas and an undercurrent of melancholy to the role. Previous work in the world, according to GARP, Terms of Endearment, television's third rock from the sun, and later dramatic turns in The Crown and Bombshell demonstrated his range from comic timing to profound seriousness. Judd functions as both mentor and cautionary figure. Lithgow's casting provided an actor capable of conveying folksy wisdom alongside the weight of past regrets and knowledge of the land's dark history. The character drinks, smokes, and carries the physical marks of a hard outdoor life. Makeup designer discussions reveal that Lithgow preferred minimal prosthetics. The team achieved his weathered appearance through detailed aging makeup, nicotine-stained fingers and beard, and age spots that suggested years of exposure. The result was a transformation that many on set found striking yet natural. Lithgow's scenes with the Creed children, particularly Ellie, required a grandfatherly warmth that could shift into stern warning. His interactions with Clark's Louis formed the philosophical core of the film, debating the ethics of interfering with death. Lithgow's classical training and experience with complex dialogue served the longer conversational passages in which Judd recounts local folklore and personal history. The actor's presence also lent credibility to the film's quieter, more atmospheric stretches, balancing the escalating horror with human scale storytelling. Jete Lawrence as Ellie Creed. Jete Lawrence was cast as Ellie Creed, the older of the two Creed children, in the same June 2018 announcement that confirmed Seimetz and the Lavoie twins. Lawrence, then approximately 10 years old during principal photography, took on a role that demanded both ordinary childhood energy and later, after the character's transformation, a chilling otherness. Directors Kelsch and Widmeyer described an extensive search for the right young actress. Many candidates possessed technical skill but lacked the ability to unsettle or match the intensity required for the darker material. The decisive step involved bringing Jason Clarke into chemistry sessions. Clarke did not soften his performance for the child actors. Instead, he maintained the full force of Louis's emotional register, forcing candidates to keep pace. Lawrence stood out by remaining unintimidated and rising to the challenge. This test confirmed she could handle the film's tonal demands. Once cast, she prepared for both the living Ellie, curious, affectionate, adjusting to a new home, and the returned version whose physical and behavioral changes required extensive prosthetic work and a shift in performance style. Makeup sequences for the undead Ellie involved full body applications, hair work, and practical effects such as visible staples. Lawrence endured long hours in the chair while maintaining focus for demanding scenes. Her work with Lithgow, Clark, and Seimetz established the family unit's emotional foundation early in the film, making later losses more impactful. Lawrence's ability to move between innocence and menace became one of the production's notable achievements. Hugo Lava and Lucas Lava as Gage Creed twins Hugo and Lucas Lava were selected to share the role of Gage Creed, the toddler son of Louis and Rachel. Casting very young children for a horror film presents logistical and ethical challenges. Using twins allowed for longer shooting days while protecting the performer's well being through shared workload and regulated hours. The Lava brothers brought natural presence and the ability to respond to direction in the limited ways appropriate for their age. Gage's limited dialogue placed greater emphasis on physical performance and reactions. The twins appeared in sequences of family life, play, and the more intense later passages. Their casting contributed to the film's sense of authentic domesticity. Parents and guardians, along with on-set child coordinators, ensured appropriate conditions throughout production. The decision to use twins also facilitated continuity in appearance across the schedule. Opsa Ahmed as Victor Pascovin, October 2018. Opsa Ahmed was announced as Victor Pascoe, the university student whose fatal accident and subsequent spectral appearances warned Louis against the burial ground. Ahmed's casting added a younger presence whose early scenes established the film's supernatural stakes. The role required both physical intensity in the accident sequence and a more ethereal quality in the ghostly visitations. Ahmed's performance helped bridge the everyday world of the university campus with the otherworldly forces at play. Alyssa Brooke Levine as Zelda Goldman also announced in October 2018. Alyssa Brooke Levine portrayed Zelda Goldman, Rachel's deceased sister, whose spinal meningitis and death haunt Rachel's memories and nightmares. In the 1989 film, the role had been played by a male stunt performer in heavy makeup. Levine's casting allowed for a more precise physical and emotional portrayal of the afflicted child. Extensive prosthetic and makeup work transformed her appearance to reflect the ravages of the disease. Levine's performance in the flashback and dream sequences provided a visceral embodiment of Rachel's deepest fears, contributing significantly to the film's psychological texture. Supporting and background performer Sonia Maria Chirila appeared as young Rachel in the childhood sequences involving Zelda. Maria Herrera played Marcella, a supporting figure in the narrative. Frank Scorpion and Linda E. Smith portrayed Rachel's father and mother, grounding the family history. Naomi Frenette appeared as an upset student, while Susie Stingle played Norma. Nurses Kelly Lee and Nina Lauren filled hospital and campus medical scenes. Party guests included Alison O'Donnell, Raphael Laporte, and Simon Pelletier Gilbert. Various children portrayed the animal masked figures in the Pet Cemetery procession. Jacob Lemieux as Mouseface, Maverick 14 as Dogface, Lou Ferrando as Rabbitface, Najia Muipatai as Catface, and Emma Hill as Horseface, along with additional uncredited young performers in Halloween and background roles. These supporting players, many drawn from the Montreal area talent pool where principal photography took place, helped populate the film's world with a sense of community and everyday life that the supernatural later disrupts animal performers. Church, the cat role of church. The Creed family cat required multiple animals. Trainer selected and prepared several cats, with Tonic primarily portraying the living church and Leo taking on the returned, more sinister version. Additional cats, including Jagger and JD, filled in for specific shots. Training emphasized positive reinforcement with clickers and treats, building confidence and willingness to perform on cue. The cat's distinct personalities informed casting choices. Tonic's more active and kitten-like energy suited the living pet, while Leo's calmer demeanor and ability to hold still served the undead sequences. Careful animal wrangling ensured the well being of the performers while delivering the necessary visual continuity and behavioral shifts. Casting process, and creative considerations. The overall casting process reflected the director's desire for authenticity and emotional credibility. Joseph Middleton and Monica Michelson oversaw casting, with additional support from Montreal based associates for local talent. Chemistry between the adult leads and the children received particular attention as the family's believability underpinned the horror. The decision to expand Rachel's role and to cast a young actress capable of both vulnerability and menace for Ellie shaped the film's tone. Lithgow's addition brought established star power and dramatic weight to the mentor figure. Clark's early attachment helped anchor the production and influenced subsequent choices. Makeup, hair, and costume departments collaborated closely with the cast to support character arcs. Weathered looks for Judd, practical family clothing for the Creeds, and progressive deterioration for the returned characters all reinforced the performances. The Canadian production base provided access to skilled local performers for supporting roles, while the principal cast brought international recognition and proven dramatic range. The ensemble's collective work established the emotional stakes necessary for the story's exploration of grief, denial, and the consequences of attempting to reverse death. Each major casting choice contributed distinct strengths. Clark's internal intensity, Seimetz's layered trauma, Lithgow's weathered wisdom, Lauren's dual-natured presence, the Lavoie twins' natural toddler energy, and the carefully prepared supporting and animal performers that together created a cohesive and affecting realization of King's material. Production development and pre-production the road to the 2019 version of Pet Sematary was a long and winding one, stretching back nearly a decade before the film finally reached theaters. Paramount Pictures first signaled its interest in revisiting Stephen King's 1983 novel in early March 2010 when the studio announced that it was developing a new adaptation and had brought on screenwriter Matt Greenberg, best known at the time for his work on the King adaptation 1408, to pen the script. For a project with such a beloved and commercially successful predecessor already sitting in the cultural memory of horror fans, the 1989 film directed by Mary Lambert had become something of a touchstone of King adaptations. Moving a new version from announcement to green light would prove to be anything but quick. Greenberg's early draft would eventually be credited only with the screen story. Once the film finally came together nearly 8 years later, a testament to how many hands and how many years separated that first announcement from the movie audiences would ultimately see by October 2013 the project had picked up new momentum, if not yet a firm release date. Producers Lorenzo di Bonaventura, a veteran of large scale genre filmmaking, and Steven Schneider, a producer with deep roots in horror, through projects like the Paranormal Activity franchise, were confirmed to be steering the production. At that stage, Spanish filmmaker Juan Carlos Fresnadillo, known for horror and thriller work, including 28 Weeks Later, was reported to be in talks to direct. This iteration of the project, however, did not move forward to production, and the adaptation once again receded from the industry trade headlines for several years, existing mostly as a known quantity that Paramount still controlled the rights to, but had not yet found the right creative alignment to actually produce. The momentum that eventually pushed the project across the finish line came somewhat indirectly from the success of another Stephen King adaptation. In August 2017, Andy Muschietti, fresh off directing the acclaimed and hugely profitable 2017 adaptation of King's 8, revealed that he and his sister and producing partner Barbara Muschietti had their own interest in tackling Pet Sematary. Their public comments about wanting to adapt the novel reflected the broader industry reality of that moment. It had proven decisively that there was a massive and hungry audience for prestige adjacent King horror, and studios that held King properties were suddenly eager to develop them. Whether or not the Muschietti's interest was the direct catalyst, the timing lines up closely with Paramount's next major move on the project. Just 2 months later, on October 30, 2017, Paramount Pictures officially greenlit the new film version of King's novel. The studio settled on the directing duo of Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmeyer, filmmakers who had built a reputation in genre circles through smaller, stylistically distinctive horror films, and who had also worked as writers on other studio horror projects. The screenplay credit at that stage went to Jeff Buller, with David Kajganich also contributing to the script, though Kajganich would ultimately go uncredited on the finished film. Alongside Di Bonaventura and Schneider, producer Mark Varadian also came aboard to help shepherd the film through production. Notably, other filmmakers had been in consideration for the director's chair before Kolsch and Widmeyer were confirmed, including Sean Carter and Johannes Roberts, the latter of whom had built a name for himself directing genre fare such as the 47 Meters Down franchise. That the studio ultimately chose a directing team rather than a single filmmaker speaks to a particular kind of creative partnership that had become more common in modern horror filmmaking, where co directors could split the enormous workload of tone setting, visual effects supervision, and performance direction that a supernatural horror film of this scale demands. With a director and script in place, the next order of business was assembling a cast capable of carrying a story built almost entirely on family grief, trauma, and escalating psychological horror. On April 16, 2018, it was announced that Jason Clarke, an Australian actor who had built a solid career playing morally complicated, often haunted characters in films across multiple genres, had been cast in the lead role of Louis Creed, the Boston ER doctor whose decision to defy the boundaries of the natural world sets the entire tragedy of the story in motion. Clark's casting gave the production a lead actor experienced in exactly the kind of internalized, slow burn performance that Louis Creed requires. A man who begins the film as a rational, science minded physician and ends it in complete psychological and moral collapse. Not long after, on May 4, 2018, John Lithgow's addition to the cast was reported, with the veteran actor taking on the role of Judd Crandall, the Cree's elderly neighbor, who first introduces Louis to the ancient burial ground behind the pet cemetery. Lithgow's casting carried its own weight of expectation, given that the role of Judd in the 1989 film had been played by Fred Gwynne in a performance many fans of the original still hold up as one of its defining elements. Bringing in an actor of Lithgow's stature and range, an actor equally comfortable in comedy, drama, and horror, signal that the production intended to give the character serious dramatic weight rather than using him purely as an exposition device. The following month, in June 2018, the production filled out its central family unit. Amy Seimetz, an actress and filmmaker known for her work in independent film circles as well as television, was announced as taking on the film's lead female role of Rachel Creed, Louis's wife, a character whose own unresolved childhood trauma involving her sister Zelda forms one of the film's most unsettling subplots. Joining her was young actress Jette Lawrence in the pivotal role of the Creed's daughter Ellie, a role that would ultimately carry an enormous amount of the film's narrative weight given the significant structural change the finished screenplay made to the novel's plot. Rounding out the family were twins Hugo and Lucas Lavoie, cast to share the role of the Creed's young son Gage, a common industry practice for productions working with very young child actors who are subject to strict limitations on hours worked per day. Casting continued to fill out through the fall of 2018. In October of that year, it was reported that actor Obsa Ahmed had been added to the cast as Victor Pascal, the doomed college student whose death at the hospital where Louis works sets the supernatural machinery of the film into motion, and whose spirit subsequently appears to Louis as a recurring warning. Alyssa Brooke Levine was also cast around this time as Zelda Goldman, Rachel's sister, whose death from spinal meningitis and the horrifying circumstances surrounding it haunt Rachel throughout the film. It is worth noting that the character of Zelda had, in the 1989 film, memorably been portrayed by stuntman Andrew Hubertzek in an unconventional and much discussed piece of casting, an approach that gave that earlier film's Zelda sequences their singularly disturbing quality. The decision for the 2019 production to move away from that approach and cast an actress in the role reflects one of many smaller creative choices the new filmmaking team made in distinguishing their version from its predecessors while still honoring the material's most memorable and disturbing elements. Taken together, the years long development process for Pet Cemetery illustrates a fairly common pattern in modern studio filmmaking, particularly with properties based on pre existing intellectual property. An initial wave of interest and announcement, followed by a fallow period during which the project exists mostly on paper while the industry's appetite for the material shifts, followed by a renewed push once external factors, in this case, the massive success of another King adaptation, make the project's commercial viability newly obvious to the studio holding the rights. From Greenberg's initial screenplay work in 2010 to the film's eventual 2019 release, the project passed through multiple writers, multiple attached directors, and nearly a decade of industry churn before finally reaching movie screens. It is worth dwelling a little further on just how significant a role the success of it played in finally unsticking Pet Sematary from its long development limbo. Prior 2017, Stephen King adaptations for the big screen had, with only occasional exceptions, struggled to translate the author's enormous commercial popularity as a novelist into consistent box office success as feature films, and studios had grown correspondingly cautious about greenlighting expensive new adaptations of his catalog. The Machetes, it upended that calculus almost overnight, becoming one of the highest grossing horror films ever released and demonstrating conclusively that a King property, handled with the right combination of directorial vision, faithful but not slavish adaptation choices, and modern production values, could draw both dedicated horror audiences and a much broader mainstream crowd. Paramount's decision to finally greenlight Pet Sematary just weeks after Andy Muschietti's public comments about wanting to adapt the same novel is unlikely to be pure coincidence. Rather, it reflects the kind of rapid, opportunistic recalibration that studios routinely undertake when a comparable property in their library suddenly demonstrates fresh commercial potential. In that sense, Pet Cemetery's eventual production owes at least part of its existence to a wave of renewed industry confidence in King adaptations that it itself generated. The choice of Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmeyer as co-directors also deserves closer examination, since directing pairs remain a relatively uncommon arrangement in mainstream studio filmmaking compared to the more typical single director model. Kolsch and Widmeyer had spent years building a working partnership across smaller, more tightly budgeted genre productions, developing a shared creative shorthand that made them an appealing choice for a studio looking to hand a beloved but tricky piece of source material to filmmakers who understood horror as a genre from the inside rather than approaching it as an unfamiliar detour from other kinds of filmmaking. Their prior writing credits on other studio horror productions also gave them first-hand experience navigating the particular development and rewrite pressures that come with adapting pre-existing intellectual property for a major studio, experience that would prove directly relevant once they took on the job of adapting Buller's screenplay for Pet Sematary into a finished film. The casting process itself spread out across roughly 2 months in the spring and summer of 2018 reflects the layered, sequential way major studio productions typically build out an ensemble, securing a lead actor first, as the production did with Jason Clarke in April 2018, gives a studio a bankable name around which to build the rest of the marketing and casting strategy, while supporting roles like Judd Crandall, Rachel Creed, and the Creed children are filled in over the following weeks and months as filming dates approach. The relatively tight window between the last major casting announcements in October 2018 and the film's finalized shooting schedule underscores how compressed pre-production timelines can become even for films that have, in a broader sense, been gestating for years at the studio level. The producing team assembled around the project also carried its own significance for how the film ultimately took shape. Lorenzo di Bonaventura's producing credits span a wide range of large scale genre franchises, giving the production a producer experienced in balancing a filmmaker's creative ambition against a studio's commercial expectations on exactly the kind of mid budget, franchise adjacent property that Pet Sematary represented. Steven Snyder's background, rooted more specifically in horror production, through his work on the Paranormal Activity series, brought a complementary genre specific perspective to the producing team, one attuned to the particular rhythms and audience expectations that distinguish horror filmmaking from other commercial genres. Mark Varadian's addition to the producing team further rounded out a group with substantial collective experience navigating exactly the kind of adaptation, casting, and scheduling challenges that a long gestating property like this one presented. Screenwriter Jeff Buhler, credited as the primary screenwriter on the finished film, brought his own genre sensibility to the project as well, having built a career writing across horror and thriller material, while David Kajganich's uncredited contributions to the script point to the often invisible collaborative process by which studio screenplays are frequently shaped by more writers than the finished film's credits alone would suggest. Filming with casting locked in and a finalized shooting script in hand. Principal photography on Pet Cemetery commenced on June 18, 2018. The production chose to shoot in Canada, specifically basing much of its work in Hudson, Quebec, a small town located along the Ottawa River not far from Montreal, along with additional filming taking place in Montreal itself. This choice of location reflects a long standing and well established practice within the modern film industry in which productions, particularly mid-budget studio genre films, shoot in Canadian provinces to take advantage of favorable tax incentives, experience local crews, and production infrastructure that has developed extensively around the Montreal filmmaking hub over the past several decades. Quebec, in particular, has become one of North America's most reliable substitutes for small town New England settings, offering production designers and location scouts the kind of dense forest, rural architecture, and seasonal atmosphere that King's main set stories require without the logistical and budgetary challenges of shooting on location in the actual state of Maine. The choice of Hudson, Quebec as a stand in for the fictional town of Ludlow, Maine, where the Creed family relocates at the start of the story, was a natural fit for a production built around atmosphere as much as narrative. The film setting depends heavily on a sense of creeping rural isolation. A house set back from a busy road, dense surrounding woodland, containing both the whimsical, community maintained pet cemetery of the title and the far more sinister ancient burial ground beyond it, and a general sense that help and civilization are just far enough away to be unreliable when the family needs it most. Achieving that atmosphere convincingly on camera requires not just competent set dressing but genuinely suitable natural landscapes. And the Quebec countryside around Hudson offered directors Kelsch and Widmeyer the kind of authentic autumnal densely wooded terrain that the story's mood depends on, working as a directing duo brought its own particular dynamics to the shoot. Kolsch and Widmeyer, who had built their reputation as a filmmaking partnership on smaller and more tightly controlled productions, were now tasked with managing a studio scale production involving a large adult and child ensemble cast. Extensive practical effects work tied to the film's escalating body horror and violence, and the technical challenges of shooting scenes involving live animals, given the pivotal narrative role played by the family cat Church. Coordinating a co directing partnership on a production of this scale requires an unusually high degree of shared creative vision and efficient division of labor, whether that meant one director focusing more closely on performance work with the cast while the other concentrated on technical setups, or the two collaborating jointly on every setup. The practical reality of directing genre films with this many moving parts places significant demands on any filmmaking partnership. They should also had to accommodate the realities of working with very young performers in psychologically and physically demanding roles. Jete Lawrence's role as Ellie required the young actress to portray both the innocent, energetic child at the start of the film and the disturbing, malevolent presence Ellie becomes after her resurrection in the film's back half, a tonal range that places considerable demands on any performer. let alone one working at a young age on a major studio horror production. Similarly, the use of twins Hugo and Lucas Lava to share the role of Gage reflects the industry standard approach to managing the strict limitations placed on how many hours a very young child can work on set in a single day, allowing the production to effectively double the available shooting time for scenes involving the character by alternating between the two boys. Principal photography continued through the summer of 2018 and ultimately wrapped on August 11th, 2018, giving the production just under 2 months of principal shooting time. That relatively compact filming schedule is consistent with the film's reported production budget, which sat in the range of $20 to $21 million, a mid budget figure for a studio horror release of this kind, allowing for meaningful practical effects, an experienced ensemble cast, and location shooting without stretching into the tens of millions more typically reserved for effects heavy tentpole productions. For a genre film built primarily around dramatic performance, practical makeup, and prosthetic effects, and atmospheric location work rather than large scale digital spectacle. A shoot of this length and budget was well suited to delivering the kind of grounded, character focused horror the filmmakers were aiming for. Shooting through the Quebec summer also gave the production a practical advantage when it came to capturing the film's autumnal visual palette without having to work around the harsher, less predictable conditions of a genuine Canadian winter. Much of the story's key action, including Church's death and burial, and the pivotal birthday party sequence in which Ellie is killed, is explicitly tied to the fall season and shooting through the warmer months, while art directing the sets and locations to read as autumn on screen allowed the filmmaking team to maintain more consistent control over weather, daylight hours, and overall shoot logistic than a true late autumn or winter shoot in rural Quebec would have permitted. This kind of seasonal compression between the shooting calendar and the stories in universe timeline is a common practice in film production, particularly for stories like this one that unfold across a fairly compressed span of in-story months but need to be captured within a tighter real-world production window. The physical production design work required to build both the whimsical children's pet cemetery, constructed with the kind of hand painted, makeshift grave markers a rural New England community of children might realistically assemble over generations, and the far more ominous ancient burial ground beyond it represented one of the more significant below the line undertakings of the shoot. The visual and tonal contrast between these two spaces is central to the story's escalating dread. The pet cemetery needs to read as sad but fundamentally innocent, a place of genuine communal grief for lost animals, while the deadfall and the ground beyond it need to communicate almost purely through production design and cinematography, an ancient wrongness that predates and exceeds anything the Creed family could have anticipated when they moved to the area. Achieving that shift in register within a single geographically continuous stretch of forest required careful location scouting and equally careful choices about lighting, color grading, and camera movement as characters cross from one space into the other. Working with live animals for the role of church added another layer of logistical complexity to the shoot. Cats are notoriously difficult performers to direct on camera, and a role like Church required to shift from a normal, docile household pet into something subtly feral and unsettling after his resurrection, likely required a combination of multiple trained cats suited to different behavioral demands, careful editing, and close coordination between the animal trainers on set and the production's animal welfare monitors, a standard practice on any film production involving live animal performers, particularly one working under studio and industry guidelines for humane treatment on set. Post production once photography wrapped in the late summer of 2018, the film moved into post production, the phase during which editors, visual effects artists, sound designers, and the composer would shape the raw footage into its final theatrical form. For a horror film that depends heavily on pacing, on knowing exactly when to hold a shot for dread and when to cut sharply for a jump scare, and on carefully calibrating how much of its more disturbing content, including violence involving a child character, to show directly versus imply, the editing process carries an outsized importance relative to many other genre categories. The film needed to balance the slow building dramatic tension of a family unraveling under grief with the more visceral, sudden violence of its back half, a tonal shift that places significant demands on pacing and structure in the editing room. Post production on the film also had to accommodate a significant structural change that distinguishes the 2019 version from both King's original novel and the 1989 film. Rather than following the novel's plot precisely, in which young Gage is the child who dies and is subsequently resurrected with horrific consequences. The new film shifted that fate onto the older sibling Ellie, allowing for a differently weighted back half of the story built around a school age child capable of speech, deception, and calculated violence rather than a toddler. This change, while decided at the screenplay stage well before cameras rolled, had substantial implications for how the film's climax was edited and paced, since a walking, talking, manipulative undead child creates different editing and performance rhythms than the more feral, near silent threat a resurrected infant would represent. The post production team's task was to make this altered structure feel inevitable and earned by the time audiences reached the film's final act, weaving J.T. Lawrence's dual performance as innocent child and predatory revenant into a coherent, escalating arc across the finished cut. visual effects, and practical makeup work during this period were similarly tasked with realizing the film's most difficult imagery. Church's transformation from a beloved family pet into something subtly, unsettlingly wrong after his resurrection. The disturbing physical toll evident on Ellie after her own return from the burial ground, and the film's climactic sequence of violence, which needed to land with real horror movie impact while still being releasable under standard theatrical ratings framework. Sound design and scoring, meanwhile, were being layered into the film during this same window, working in tandem with the picture edit to build the atmosphere of mounting dread that defines the film's midsection before the score and sound work shifted into a more aggressively frightening register for the film's violent conclusion. Color grading and overall visual finishing also played a significant role in establishing the film's tonal identity during post production. Horror films set in rural wooded environments frequently lean on desaturated or cool toned color palettes to establish unease, and a film built around a family's slow descent from ordinary domestic life into supernatural horror benefits from a visual grading strategy that can track that psychological descent almost imperceptibly, shifting the coloring of the Kree's world by degrees as the story darkens, rather than making an abrupt, obvious change once the supernatural elements take hold. Coordinating that gradual visual shift across the finished cut is squarely the work of post production colorists working closely with the directors and cinematographer to ensure the film's look evolves in lockstep with its narrative and emotional arc. Sound mixing for a film like this also carries particular weight, given how much of the story's horror depends on quiet, sustained dread, punctuated by sudden violent noise rather than constant loud scoring. Establishing the right balance between near silence, ambient rural sound, wind through trees, distant traffic on the road that ultimately claims both church and alley, the creak of an old house at night, and the score's more overt musical cues requires careful iterative work in the sound mixing stage, refining the balance reel by reel until the finished film's soundscape supports rather than undercuts its visual storytelling. This kind of detailed audio post production work, while rarely discussed in the film's public facing coverage, represents a substantial and necessary component of turning the raw production footage and Christopher Young's completed score into the polished theatrical experience audiences ultimately saw in cinemas beginning in the spring of 2019. Music, the film's original score, was composed by Christopher Young, a veteran composer with an extensive history in the horror genre, having previously scored a wide range of genre films across a career spanning decades. Bringing a composer with Young's specific background in horror scoring to a project like Pet Sematary gave the productions a scope capable of doing serious dramatic work rather than functioning merely as a collection of jump scare stingers, a distinction that matters enormously in a film whose horror is as rooted in grief and dread as it is in sudden violence. The score's track list, as reflected in its eventual soundtrack release, gives a clear sense of how closely the music was built around the film's specific narrative beats and thematic concerns. Tracks such as The Wendigo and Unhallowed Even point directly to the film's central supernatural mythology, the ancient and malevolent presence believed to inhabit the burial ground beyond the pet cemetery. Others, like The Main Road and Fielding Fine, suggest more scene specific or transitional cues, the kind of connective musical tissue that helps establish setting and pacing between a film's larger set piece moments. Titles like But the Cat Has No Hat and Church Isn't Church point to the score's attention to the character of Church specifically, underscoring how much narrative and emotional weight the film places on the family cat's transformation as an early, smaller scale warning of what awaits the family later at the burial ground. Meanwhile, cues such as Dead Alive Again, Watching the Dead Do, and Die Daddy Die chart the score's escalation into the film's darkest and most violent territory, tracking the shift from atmospheric dread into full blown horror movie intensity as the Creed family's tragedy reaches its climax. The final score track, Wasn't the Beginning, carries a title that gestures toward the film's bleak, cyclical ending and the implication that the horror the family has unleashed is far from over. Beyond Young's original orchestral score, the film makes a notable needle drop choice at its close. The end credits feature a cover version of Pet Sematary, the song originally recorded by the American punk rock band The Ramones for the 1989 film adaptation and famously written for that film at Stephen King's own personal request to the band. For the 2019 remake, that song was covered by the American punk rock band Starcrawler, a choice that allowed the new film to pay direct homage to one of the most beloved and enduring pieces of pop culture ephemera associated with the Pet Cemetery franchise, while still updating the sound for a new generation of genre film soundtrack. Using a cover rather than the original Ramones recording, let the 2019 film honor that legacy without simply reusing an asset already strongly identified with its predecessor, giving the new film its own distinct sonic identity. For the moment audiences leave the theater, the film's complete score, alongside the Starcrawler cover, was ultimately released commercially by Waxwork Records, a label that has built a strong reputation within genre film fandom, specifically for producing high quality vinyl releases of horror and science fiction film scores. Waxwork issued the Pet Cemetery soundtrack as a double LP in 2019 following the film's theatrical release, a format and release strategy well suited to the label's core audience of horror soundtrack collectors, who have increasingly driven a broader resurgence of interest in vinyl releases of genre film scores over the past decade. The decision to give the score a dedicated vinyl release rather than treating the music purely as a digital or streaming afterthought reflects both Young's stature as a composer within horror fan circles and the broader collectible appeal that a film like Pet Sematary, tied to one of Stephen King's most enduringly popular novels, was expected to carry among genre enthusiasts. Christopher Young's broader body of work within the horror genre gave him a particular set of tools well suited to this project's specific needs. Composers who move frequently between horror projects tend to develop a versatile musical vocabulary for conveying dread that does not rely purely on the loud, sudden orchestral stabs most casually associated with jump scares and instead can sustain tension across long, dialogue driven scenes. Using more subtle instrumentation, unconventional textures, and carefully controlled dynamic build. That kind of scoring approach suits Pet Cemetery particularly well since so much of the film's first half is built around slow building domestic unease rather than overt supernatural spectacle, requiring a score capable of signaling to the audience that something is deeply wrong long before the story's more explicit horror elements arrive. Only in the film's back half, once Ellie has returned from the burial ground and the story shifts decisively into violent, visceral horror, does the score appear to embrace the kind of more aggressive, percussive intensity suggested by track titles like Scream for More and Die Daddy Die, mirroring the film's own structural and tonal escalation. The choice to pair that original orchestral work with a single, carefully chosen piece of licensed music at the very end of the film. The Starcrawler cover of the Ramones' Pet Cemetery also reflects a broader trend in modern horror filmmaking in which end credits needle drops are increasingly used as a kind of tonal palette cleanser, releasing the tension the preceding 2 hours have built while simultaneously reinforcing a film's connection to its genre lineage. Because the original Ramones song was written specifically for the franchise at Stephen King's own request nearly 3 decades earlier. It carries a layer of built-in mythology within horror fandom that few other pieces of licensed music could replicate. Using a newly recorded cover rather than the original recording allowed the 2019 film to invoke that legacy directly while still asserting its own distinct identity as a different film for a different era of horror filmmaking. Release Theatrical Pet Cemetery took its first public bow not in a conventional wide theatrical rollout, but at a film festival with deep roots in genre programming. The film had its world premiere at South by Southwest on March 16, 2019. SXSW, held annually in Austin, Texas, has become an increasingly significant early exposure platform for genre and horror films, specifically offering studios a chance to generate word of mouth buzz and early critical reaction among an audience of engaged festival goers and press before a film's wider commercial release. Premiering there gave Pet Sematary several weeks of lead time to generate press coverage, social media buzz, and critical discussion ahead of its actual box office debut, a fairly standard promotional strategy for studio horror releases, aiming to build anticipation among genre fans specifically. Following its festival premiere, the film was released theatrically across the United States on April 5, 2019, distributed by Paramount Pictures. That release date, however, was not the one originally planned for the production. The film had initially been slated for an April 19, 2019 release, but Paramount opted to move the film's release date 2 weeks earlier, shifting it from April 19 to April 5, 2019. Release date shuffles of this kind are a routine part of studio distribution strategy, often driven by a combination of factors, including competitive positioning against other major releases on the calendar, marketing timeline considerations, and a studio's broader slate planning across an entire release year. Moving the film earlier in April placed it in a notably competitive stretch of the spring 2019 box office calendar rather than avoiding it, suggesting Paramount's confidence in the film's ability to hold its own against significant competition rather than needing a quieter release window. That confidence would be tested immediately since Pet Sematary's actual opening weekend placed it directly alongside two other notable releases. The superhero film Shazam, based on the DC Comics character, and the ensemble drama The Best of Enemies, facing off against a major superhero tentpole in the same opening weekend is a considerable competitive challenge for any film, let alone a mid budget horror remake, and pre release tracking reflected that dynamic. Industry projections ahead of the weekend estimated that Pet Cemetery would gross somewhere in the range of $20 million to $30 million from roughly two 500 theaters in its opening weekend. A solid but not spectacular projection for a horror release of its budget level, reflecting the reality that it would inevitably finish behind Shazam at the top of the box office chart that weekend, but still had a meaningful audience of its own to draw on given the enduring popularity of King's source material and the built in brand recognition of the Pet Cemetery title itself. The film's theatrical release rollout followed the standard modern pattern of Thursday preview screenings ahead of the official Friday opening. Those Thursday night previews brought in $2.3 million, an early signal of the film's opening weekend trajectory. Combined with its official Friday opening, the film grossed $10 million on its first day of release, including those preview earnings, setting it on a path toward what would ultimately become a strong, if second place, opening weekend performance relative to the far larger box office draw of Shazam. The distribution and marketing decisions Paramount made around the film's theatrical release, from choosing a genre friendly festival premiere to wide release squarely within a competitive spring weekend rather than seeking out a quieter berth on the calendar, reflect a studio betting on the inherent commercial pull of Steven brand and the Pet Sematary title specifically to carry the film through a crowded movie-going weekend. The strategic value of the SXSW premiere in particular is worth considering in a bit more depth. Unlike a festival such as Cannes or Venice, whose programming leans heavily toward art house and prestige award season fare, SXSW has cultivated a reputation over the years as an especially welcoming home for genre premieres, drawing an audience of engaged festival attendees, entertainment journalists, and online genre media outlets whose early coverage can meaningfully shape a film's pre release narrative. Debuting a horror remake there, roughly 3 weeks ahead of its wide theatrical release, gave Paramount's marketing team a valuable early window in which to generate reaction pieces, social media buzz, and word of mouth discussion among exactly the audience segment most likely to see the film on opening weekend and evangelize it to others, all before the far larger and more diffuse mainstream audience encountered the film's marketing campaign in earnings previews, trailers, and traditional advertising in the weeks that followed. The decision to move the release date 2 weeks earlier from the originally planned April 19, 2019 to April 5, 2019 also merits some further context. Studios routinely adjust release dates in response to shifts elsewhere on the competitive calendar, whether that means avoiding a newly announced competing release, taking advantage of a suddenly open weekend, or repositioning a film relative to school schedules, holidays, or other seasonal factors that influence movie going patterns. Whatever the specific calculus behind Paramount's decision in this case, the net effect was to place Pet Sematary on a weekend already anchored by the considerably larger release of Shazam, a scheduling decision that guaranteed the horror film would not claim the top box office spot that particular weekend, but that nonetheless still allowed it to draw a substantial audience of its own, given how different the two films' target demographics were in practice. Superhero tentpoles and horror remakes, while both broadly mainstream genre products, tend to draw meaningfully different, if overlapping, audience segments, meaning direct competition between the two is somewhat less zero sum than it might initially appear. Home media, while the theatrical release captured the bulk of the film's commercial and critical attention in the spring of 2019, Pet Semetary's life on home media formed an additional meaningful component of its overall commercial performance. According to available financial data, the film generated $6.9 million specifically in home sales. That figure, while modest relative to the film's overall theatrical box office haul, reflects the continuing, if steadily diminishing, role that physical and digital home media purchases played in a studio horror film's total revenue picture in the years just before streaming services came to dominate audiences' post theatrical viewing habits almost entirely. For horror fans in particular, a genre audience that has historically shown a stronger than average tendency to build physical media collections around beloved franchises. A release like Pet Sematary, tied to a title with decades of brand recognition through King's novel and the 1989 film adaptation, represented the kind of title well suited to generating continued purchase interest well after its theatrical run concluded, whether through standard retail home video releases or through the kind of specialty and collector's editions that horror distributors have increasingly used to court dedicated genre audiences. Reception box Office Pet Cemetary's theatrical run ultimately produced a solid, if unspectacular, financial outcome relative to its production costs. The film grossed $54.7 million across the United States and Canada, and an additional 58.3 million across other international territories, for a worldwide theatrical total of $113.1 million. Measured against the film's production budget of $21 million, that worldwide gross represents a healthy multiple return relative to production costs, though, of course, a film's overall profitability also depends heavily on marketing and distribution expenditures that are not reflected in the production budget figure alone. Even accounting for those additional costs, a worldwide gross more than 5 times the reported production budget represents a commercially successful outcome for a mid budget horror remake, validating Paramount's decision to move the long gestating project into production after years of development limbo. The film's opening weekend performance offers a more granular look at how that overall total came together, facing direct competition from Shazam. In its debut frame, Pet Sematary ultimately opened to $24.5 million domestically, finishing in second place at the box office behind the DC superhero film. Given that Shazam had been tracking toward a considerably larger opening than Pet Sematary going into the weekend, a second place finish with a $24 5 million debut represented a respectable outcome for the horror film, sitting comfortably within and toward the upper end of its pre-release tracking projections. For context, a $24 5 million opening weekend on a $21 million production budget meant the film had already recouped the large majority of its production costs domestically within its first 3 days of wide release, before accounting for the additional revenue that would continue to accumulate both domestically and internationally over the following weeks. Like most horror films, however, Pet Sematary saw a steep decline in its box office earnings once the initial opening weekend excitement subsided, a pattern that is almost definitionally typical of the genre, since horror titles tend to front load their audiences into the first weekend of release far more heavily than other genres. Driven by fans eager to see a new release, before spoilers circulate, and by the type of event driven, must see immediately marketing that horror studios typically employ. The film dropped 60% in its second weekend of release, falling to $9, 7 million, and finishing in fourth place domestically that weekend as a new wave of releases entered the marketplace and competed for the same audience. The decline continued into the film's third weekend, during which it earned $4.9 million and slipped further down the chart to seventh place domestically. This trajectory, a strong opening followed by a steep, characteristic horror genre drop off in subsequent weekends, is a familiar shape for the genre and does not necessarily indicate audience dissatisfaction so much as it reflects horror's generally front loaded consumption pattern, in which a film's commercial fate is disproportionately determined by its opening weekend performance relative to its long term theatrical legs. Taken as a whole, the box office run tells the story of a film that successfully capitalized on strong opening interest driven by brand recognition and built-in audience curiosity about how a new generation of filmmakers would handle King's well-known and, for many longtime fans, personally significant source material before settling into the more modest, rapidly declining earnings pattern typical of the horror genre as a whole. The film's ultimate worldwide total of $113, 1 million against a $21 million budget, stands as a clear commercial success by any conventional measure of studio filmmaking economics, even if its week to week trajectory reflected the volatile front loaded nature of horror box office performance more broadly. The relatively even split between the film's domestic total of $54.7 million and its international haul of $58.3 million is itself worth noting, since horror as a genre does not always travel internationally with the same consistency as, say, large scale action or superhero franchises, whose spectacle driven appeal tends to translate more uniformly across different markets and cultures. That Pet Sematary generated a slightly larger share of its total gross from international markets than from North America suggests the film, and by extension, the broader Stephen King brand underpinning it, carried genuine commercial pull well beyond its home market, a reflection of just how globally recognized King's work as an author has become over the decades, independent of any specific film adaptation's individual marketing push in a given territory. It is also useful to place Pet Sematary's box office performance within the broader context of the modern horror remake as a commercial category. Remakes of previously successful horror properties carry both inherent advantages and inherent risks relative to wholly original horror films. On one hand, a built in title with decades of audience familiarity, as Pet Sematary enjoyed both through King's original novel and the well remembered 1989 film, provides a substantial marketing head start relative to an unknown original concept helping explain the film's comparatively strong opening weekend relative to its production budget. On the other hand, that same built-in familiarity raises the bar for audience expectations and invites the kind of direct, often unfavorable comparison to a beloved predecessor that an original film never has to contend with, a dynamic that likely factored into both the film's mixed critical reception and its steep post opening weekend box office decline, as some portion of its opening audience left theaters less than fully satisfied with how the new film measured up against fond memories of the original. Critical response, critical reaction to Pet Sematary upon its release was, in the language most commonly used to describe films, that generate a genuinely split reaction rather than broad consensus in either direction, mixed. On Rotten Tomatoes, the review aggregation site that has become one of the most widely cited barometers of a film's overall critical reception, Pet Sematary holds an approval rating of 57% based on a substantial sample of 276 collected reviews, with those reviews averaging out to a rating of 5, 9 out of 10. That approval percentage places the film squarely in the mixed range on the platform's rating scale, high enough to indicate that a clear majority but not overwhelming share of critics found things to appreciate in the film, but far short of the kind of consensus approval that would mark it as a broadly beloved critical success. The site's official critical consensus summary characterized the film as one that takes King's source material in some different directions compared to prior adaptations, while ultimately landing somewhere between a genuine creative revival of the material and something closer to disturbing its established legacy rather than building meaningfully upon it. A fairly candid acknowledgement from the aggregator that critics were divided on whether the film's departures from its source material, most notably the shift in which child character dies and returns, represented a worthwhile creative risk or a betrayal of what made the original story resonate so strongly with readers and earlier film audiences. Metacritic, another major review aggregation platform that differs from Rotten Tomatoes, primarily in its methodology of assigning a weighted numerical score to each individual review rather than sorting reviews into a binary positive or negative bucket, tells a broadly consistent story. The film holds a weighted average score of 57 out of 100 on the platform, calculated across 42 critics, a figure the site's own classification system labels as indicating mixed or average reviews. The close numerical alignment between the film's Rotten Tomatoes percentage and its Metacritic score, both landing at 57, offers a useful cross that the film's critical reception genuinely settled into a middle ground rather than one platform's methodology producing an outlier result. Films that land in this particular critical zone typically generate reviews that praise certain specific elements: strong central performances, effective atmosphere, a genuinely unsettling sense of dread in certain stretches, while raising more serious concerns about other aspects, whether that be pacing, tonal consistency, or fidelity to the emotional and thematic core of well loved source material. Audience reaction, as distinct from professional critical response, followed a somewhat different but related pattern. Cinema Score, the polling firm that has for decades surveyed opening night moviegoers as they exit theaters to gauge immediate audience reaction to new releases, recorded an average grade of C for Pet Cemetery on its letter grade scale, running from A plus down to F. A C grade sits below the grades horror films typically need to be considered strong audience successes, though horror as a genre has historically tended to earn lower cinema score grades on average than other major genres, even for films that go on to be considered successful or well regarded within the genre. Since CinemaScore's methodology has been noted by industry observers to skew somewhat unfavorably for horror specifically, a genre whose intended emotional effect, unsettling, distressing, or frightening audiences, does not always translate into the kind of immediate, uncomplicated satisfaction that tends to produce top tier cinema score grades even when a film is otherwise achieving exactly what it set out to do artistically. A separate audience polling service, Post Track, which similarly surveys opening weekend audiences, but through a different methodology and set of questions than CinemaScore, produced a somewhat more favorable, if still tempered, picture of audience sentiment. Audiences polled by PostTrack gave the film an overall positive score of 66%, alongside a definite recommend figure of 47%, the latter measuring the percentage of surveyed audience members who indicated they would specifically and unreservedly recommend the film to others rather than offering a more qualified or lukewarm endorsement. A 47% definite recommend score reflects a genuinely divided reaction among opening weekend audiences. A meaningful share of viewers left the theater ready to actively champion the film to friends and family, while a comparable share came away with a more mixed or hesitant reaction, mirroring almost exactly the kind of split, middle of the road response that both major critical aggregators had already captured among professional reviewers. Taken together, the various measures of the film's reception, critical aggregation scores hovering right around the midpoint on both major platforms. An audience cinema score grade on the lower end, typical for horror releases, and a post-track response indicating a genuinely divided audience rather than a broadly enthusiastic one, paint a consistent overall picture of a film that succeeded in generating discussion and engagement, particularly around its bold structural departure from King's novel in shifting which child dies and returns from the dead without achieving the kind of broad cross audience consensus that would have marked it as an unambiguous critical or audience triumph. That the film nonetheless performed solidly at the box office. Despite this mixed reception, underscores how, for a title carrying the built-in brand recognition of the Pet Sematary name and the broader commercial pull of the Stephen King brand more generally, strong opening weekend curiosity was ultimately capable of carrying the film to a clearly profitable outcome, even in the absence of the kind of unanimous critical and audience acclaim that might have extended its box office legs further into the following weeks. The film's mixed but engaged reception also set the stage for the property's continued life beyond the 2019 release. Producer Lorenzo di Bonaventura indicated as early as March 2019, in the immediate aftermath of the film's release, that discussions of a possible prequel had already begun. A development screenwriter, Jeff Buller, subsequently confirmed and elaborated on, describing early ambition to further explore the mythology surrounding the burial ground's Mi'kmaq origins, the Wendigo, and the deeper history of Judd Crandall's own life in the town, narrative threads that the 2019 film had only gestured toward. That prequel project was officially greenlit in February 2021, with Buller and Di Bonaventura returning to their respective screenwriting and producing roles, and the resulting film titled Pet Cemetery. Bloodlines ultimately premiered at Fantastic Fest in September 2023 before being released via streaming exclusively on Paramount Plus in October 2023, a direct continuation of the creative and commercial world the 2019 film established, and a clear indication that, mixed reviews notwithstanding, the 2019 Pet Cemetery had done enough at the box office and in cultural conversation to justify the studio's continued investment in expanding the franchise. The particular fault line running through much of the film's critical discussion centered, as the Rotten Tomatoes consensus itself suggests, on the screenplay's decision to substantially alter the fate of the Creed children relative to King's novel. In the source material and in the 1989 film that hewed closely to it, it is the toddler Gage who dies and is subsequently resurrected, a choice that generates a very particular, almost unbearable register of horror built around innocence, corrupted in its most literal pre-verbal form. By shifting that fate to Ellie, the older, school-age daughter, the 2019 film gained a resurrected antagonist capable of speech, manipulation, and a far wider range of calculated human-like malice, allowing for extended dialogue-driven confrontations between Ellie and her surviving family members that would have been structurally impossible with a nonverbal toddler in the equivalent role. Critics who responded favorably to the film often pointed to this change as a genuinely bold and narratively fruitful reinvention, one that gave Jete Lawrence significant room to deliver a memorable, unsettling performance, and that offered longtime readers and viewers a genuine surprise rather than a beat for beat replay of a story many already knew intimately. Critics who responded less favorably, by contrast, frequently argued that the change, whatever its individual merits, ultimately diluted some of the specific primal horror that made the novel's original scenario so effective, while also compressing or rushing certain other elements of the story to accommodate the altered structure. Beyond the question of fidelity to the source material, critical commentary on the film's performances tended to be more consistently positive than commentary on the film as a whole. Jason Clarke's portrayal of Louis Creed's slow unraveling from a rational, grief stricken father into someone willing to defy the natural order of death itself was frequently singled out as a genuine strength of the production, as was John Lithgow's performance as Judd Crandall, which many reviewers treated as a worthy, if intentionally different, counterpart to Fred Gwynn's well remembered performance in the 1989 original. Jete Lawrence's dual performance as both the innocent, endearing Ellie of the film's first half and the disturbing, predatory presence she becomes afterward also drew considerable praise, with several critics noting the unusual range the young performer was able to bring to such tonally divergent halves of a single character. Where critical opinion diverged more sharply was in assessments of the film's pacing and its balance between slow building dread and more conventional horror movie mechanics such as jump scares. Some reviewers praised the film's willingness to let its first half breathe, building tension through the Creed family's grief and Louis's mounting, quietly desperate curiosity about the burial ground's power before releasing that tension in a genuinely shocking and violent back half. Others found the film's shifts between these registers less successfully integrated, arguing that certain sequences lean too heavily on familiar horror genre shorthand at the expense of the slower, more psychologically grounded tension that distinguished the film's stronger stretches. This particular disagreement between viewers who found the film's tonal range to be a genuine strength and those who found it uneven runs through much of the published criticism and helps explain why the film settled so consistently around the midpoint on both Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic rather than clustering more heavily toward either the positive or negative end of either scale. The gap between the film's cinema score grade and its post-track figures also invites some further reflection, since the two audience measurement services, while both surveying opening night moviegoers, tend to capture somewhat different dimensions of audience reaction. CinemaScore's simple letter grade methodology captures a broad, immediate gut reaction to the overall movie-going experience, while post-track's more granular positive response and definite recommend metrics allow for a somewhat more nuanced picture of how strongly, rather than simply whether, audiences responded favorably. That Pet Sematary posted a comparatively modest C on the former while still generating a majority positive score on the latter, suggests a film that many opening weekend audience members appreciated on balance without necessarily loving unreservedly. Again, consistent with the broader theme running through nearly every measure of the film's reception, professional and audience alike. A story that clearly connected with a meaningful share of the people who saw it without ever quite achieving the kind of broad, decisive consensus, positive or negative, that tends to define a film's reputation most durably in the years following its release.